Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here. Most of the stories we tell on this channel have a villain. Someone who runs a scam. Someone who takes the money and disappears. Someone you can point at and say, that's who did it. Those stories are real, and we'll keep telling them, because people need to hear them before they book the flight. But today's story is harder than that. Today's story is about a man who lost money to a life he actually wanted. And if you've ever wondered why that might be more dangerous than a straightforward con, well, that's exactly why we're here. His name is Declan Morrissey. He's 54 years old, from Limerick in the west of Ireland, and he spent 30 years as a head chef, hotel kitchens mostly. A man who built his entire life around feeding other people and who arrived in Vietnam at 53 with his savings and his pension and absolutely no one left to cook for. Declan didn't lose everything in Vietnam. I want to be clear about that up front, but he lost enough. And what he lost enough. And what he lost beyond the money, that's the part of this story that's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, where do I start? I start where I always start, which is the kitchen. Because that's where everything begins for me, and honestly, it's where everything ends too. 30 years. That's not a career, that's a sentence. I started washing dishes at the Limerick Strand when I was 19. Pots, mostly. The big stock pots that come up to your knee and weigh about the same as a small child when they're full. You burn your forearms on the oven rack, you cut yourself on a mandolin because you're rushing and you always rush, and by the time you're 40, your lower back has the structural integrity of a wet cardboard box. That's the job. I loved it. I genuinely loved it. I want to say that before anything else, because I don't want you thinking I was miserable the whole time. I wasn't. I was a head chef in a decent hotel by the time I was 31, and there's a particular kind of pride in running a kitchen well. Everything in its place. Every station covered. Service goes out clean and on time. It's the closest I ever came to feeling like I was genuinely good at something. But kitchens take things from you quietly. They take your evenings. First, ... Then the school plays, and the Sunday lunches, and the birthdays where you show up at 9:30, smelling of sauce, and your daughters are already in their pajamas, and your wife has that look, not angry, just tired. The particular tiredness of a woman who's been managing everything alone again. Siobhan and I were married 22 years. We met when we were both 28, which feels like an impossible age to me now. Like a country I used to live in. She was a secondary school teacher, maths, patient, organized, far more sensible than me in every financial decision we ever made. She left me for a man she met at a Pilates class in Castle Troy. He's an estate agent. He's home by 6 every evening, apparently. I mention this not with bitterness, or, well, some bitterness. I'm Irish, and it'd be unnatural not to, but mostly just to explain the precise comedy of it. 30 years in kitchens, and I got beaten by a man who sells semi-detached and does his stretches on a Tuesday morning. The divorce took 14 months and cost me more than I want to think about. Not just the legal fees, those were about €9,000, which is the kind of money that used to mean something to me. But the settlement, we sold the house in Dooradoyle. That was supposed to be the retirement plan, the house. Modest enough by Dublin standards, but it was ours, or it had been ours. And by the time everything was divided up, I walked away with €88,000 and an early state pension I'd accessed 2 years before I should have, because I needed the income. Taking the pension early cost you about 12% of what you'd eventually get. I knew that. I did it anyway. The maths of desperation is its own subject. My daughters, Aoife and Clodagh, 17 and 15 at the time, they stayed with Siobhan, which made sense. Of course it made sense. They needed their mother, and they needed stability. And I was a man who'd missed roughly 60% of their childhoods due to Saturday service. I understood this. I told myself I understood this. The understanding and the feeling of it are two different things, and I'm still working out the distance between them. I moved into a bedsit above a chipper on O'Connell Street. Nice chipper, actually, Hogan's. They do a good battered sausage. I couldn't cook in the bedsit. I had a 2-ring hob, and I just couldn't. A man who'd run a kitchen for 30 people, and I couldn't bring myself to make an omelet on a Tuesday evening. So mostly I ate from Hogan's, or I walked down to Dunn's and bought those meal deal sandwiches, ham and cheese, white bread, too much mayo, and I ate them standing at the kitchen counter because I couldn't quite manage to sit down at the table alone. I went on for about 4 months. I wasn't depressed. I want to be careful about that word because I know what actual depression looks like, and this wasn't it. It was more like the volume had been turned down on everything, not silent, just quieter than it should have been. I went to work at the hotel. I came home. I watched television. I couldn't tell you the content of. I rang Ioife on Sundays, and we talked for 8 minutes on average because teenagers have things to do, and their father calling from his bedsit is not, it turns out, the highlight of their week. And then one night, I'd say it was November, so about 5 months after Siobhan left, I was on the laptop at midnight. I'd been watching cooking videos, which is what I do when I can't sleep, because it's the only version of work that doesn't feel like work. And the algorithm took me somewhere unexpected. A video about street food in Hainan, some fella walking through a night market with a bowl of caole au, talking about the noodles, the broth, the specific charcoal smoke of the grills. I watched it twice. Then there was a video about cost of living in Da Nang. Then another one. Then a man from Manchester, and I said to someone afterwards that he was not unlike myself, which is the most Irish way in the world of describing a man who is nothing like me, talking about how he lived comfortably in Vietnam on €1,500 a month. Pension plus savings. Warm weather, good food, a city where you weren't invisible. Now, I'd been to Lanzarote once, in 2009, and I hated every minute of it. Package holiday, hotel buffet, English lager by the pool. The food was an embarrassment. I'd never thought about Southeast Asia. I'm a Limerick man. We don't go to Southeast Asia. We go to Tenerife and we complain about the price of Guinness. But the food in those videos, I'm telling you. For a chef, Vietnamese cooking is a kind of argument about what food is supposed to be, the freshness of it, the precision, the way every bowl is 5 things at once and none of them fighting each other. Pho, bun bo hue, bonixio. I was taking notes at midnight on a Tuesday like a first-year culinary student. I told myself I was interested in the food, and I was. But there was another thing in those videos I was watching for, and I didn't name it for several more weeks. All those men, British, Australian, American, sitting in cafes and markets, eating well, living cheaply, apparently at ease with themselves. They all looked very comfortable. None of them looked like they had anyone to go home to. I spent 4 months researching before I booked anything. Spreadsheets, cost breakdowns, visa requirements, Irish passport, gets 90 days visa-free, extendable. I found expat forums, joined a Da Nang Facebook group, read every thread about healthcare and housing, and whether the internet was reliable enough to stream the rugby. I built a budget. A proper one, €1,200 a month all in, with a contingency of 200 on top. I thought I'd done my homework. I had done my homework. The problem wasn't the homework. The problem was what the homework didn't cover, which was the person I was going to become once I got there, and what that person was going to need. But I didn't know that yet. I booked the flight in late January. Da Nang, departing Dublin, March the 4th. I remember standing in the bedsit after I hit confirm, looking at the booking email on my phone. And for the first time in, I don't know how long, I felt curious. Not happy, exactly. Just curious about what was going to happen next. I'd forgotten that was a feeling I was capable of. I packed a chef's knife. Just the one. A Wusthof I'd had since 2003. Everything else I could replace. Da Nang Airport at 7 in the morning, in March, is not a gentle introduction to anywhere. I walked out of arrivals, and the heat just, it doesn't hit you exactly. It more wraps itself around you, like opening an oven door. Except the oven is the size of a country. 48 hours earlier, I'd been standing on O'Connell Street in Limerick, in a February drizzle, watching a pennies bag blow into a puddle. Now there were motorbikes everywhere, and someone was selling something from a cart, and the air smelled of diesel and something sweet I couldn't identify, and 3 different people were trying to get me into their taxi simultaneously. I stood there for probably 30 seconds longer than I needed to. Just stood there. I'd booked a serviced apartment near Macquarie Beach, found it on a Facebook group, €270 a month, which I thought was a typo until 3 separate people confirmed it wasn't. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a narrow building on a street I couldn't pronounce, with a small balcony that looked out over the rooftops and the tangle of power lines that seemed to connect every building in Vietnam to every other building via a system that no qualified electrician would ever sign off on. The bedroom was clean. The kitchen had a proper hob. There was a coffee maker. I unpacked my bag, put the Wusthof in the knife block they'd left on the counter, and stood at the balcony looking out at Da Nang waking up below me. And I thought, right then. The first 2 weeks I barely spoke to another Western person. I didn't want to, particularly. That sounds rude, and I don't mean it rudely. It's just that the whole point, the part one hadn't quite admitted to myself back in Limerick, was that I needed somewhere nobody knew me. Nobody knew about the divorce. Nobody knew about the bedsit. Nobody had that careful face people get when they ask how you're doing, and they already know the answer isn't great. In Da Nang, I was just a tall Irish fella who walked slowly and looked at food stalls with what was apparently an unusual degree of concentration. And the food. God, where do I start? I'd watched the videos and I thought I had some idea. I didn't have any idea. The market near me, CCN Market, about 15 minutes walk, had a wet section and a dry section and a cooked food section. And one spent about 2 hours in it, on my second morning, like a man visiting a cathedral. Which, for a chef, it is. A woman was making banciao, those crispy turmeric crepes stuffed with prawn and bean sprout, on a flat iron griddle about the size of a dustbin lid, and she was turning them with her bare hands in a move that would give a health and safety inspector a full cardiac episode, and they were the best thing I'd eaten in 10 years. I ate too. She charged me 40,000 dong. That's about €1.50. I stood there doing the maths, and then did them again because they seemed wrong. I started a food journal that second day. Just a cheap notebook from a stationery shop on Trun Phu. I'd bought it on impulse, which isn't like me. I wrote down what I'd eaten, what was in it, what I thought about the technique. I hadn't written anything down for myself in 20 years. In kitchens, you write things down for other people. The prep list, the specials board, the allergen register. Writing something down because you wanted to remember it for yourself, felt, and I'm aware this sounds dramatic, like something I used to know how to do. I did the budget sums obsessively in those first weeks, the way I've always done numbers, when I'm anxious. Rent, €270. Food, eating out twice a day, maybe 150. Transport, I wasn't driving, just walking or grabbing a grab bike occasionally, €30. A couple of beers in the evening at a place near the beach, the kind of spot with plastic stools on the pavement, and cold cans of 333 for 20,000 dong each, €40. Generous estimate. Total, roughly €490. Against a pension of 1,100. I could save €600 a month and live what felt, after the bedsit above Hogan's, like an extraordinarily good life. The Manchester fella had been right. I didn't want to admit it, because the Manchester fella had also been slightly smug about it, but he'd been right. After about 10 days, I found the Tuesday morning coffee group, which is a thing that exists in Da Nang and probably every city in Southeast Asia where a certain number of Western men have washed up, retired, divorced, or simply run out of reasons to stay home. They met at a cafe on Biaojing near the Han River. The coffeehouse chain, actual chairs, not plastic stools. There were 7 of them that first Tuesday, British mostly. A couple of Australians. One Canadian who barely spoke. They'd been there between 6 months and 5 years, and within about 20 minutes of sitting down, you could sort them into 2 types, the ones who were genuinely building something, and the ones who were waiting to be allowed to go home without admitting defeat. Gary was in the first group. Retired postman from Stoke-on-Trent, been in Da Nang 4 years, moved there because his wife had died and his kids were grown, and he'd decided, at 61, that he was owed a few warm winters. Quiet man. Dry. The kind of English bloke who expresses approval by not disapproving, which I respect. He asked me what I'd eaten that week, and when I told him about the banzero, he nodded like I'd said something sensible. We talked about food for about 40 minutes, and I thought, this is fine. This is actually fine. I want to be honest about something, because this channel is about honesty, and I've watched enough of these stories to know the bit I'm about to tell you is where people usually start foreshadowing. I'm not going to do that. At this point in the story, I was a 53-year-old man with a food journal and a very affordable apartment and a new acquaintance who liked banh mi. That was it. There was no darkness gathering. I was just, reasonably, genuinely, perhaps embarrassingly, happy. The cooking class was a professional decision, or I told myself it was. You go to a new city, you find out what the kitchens know. That's not tourism, that's research, and I had 30 years of instinct that said the technique is always in the details. The class was held in a shophouse near the Han River Bridge, one of those restored ones with the wide plank floors and the terracotta pots of Vietnamese coriander and perilla, and a dozen herbs I didn't have names for yet, all lined up along the windowsills in the afternoon light. 6 students, 2 instructors. The first instructor was a cheerful young man who explained each dish slowly and with great patience, which was fine. The second instructor was Lynn. She was 29. She had the particular quality of attention that good kitchen people have, watching everything and appearing to watch nothing, which is harder to develop than it looks. She came over to where I was working, and without preamble, without so much as an apology or a warning, she moved my knife hand 3 centimeters to the left and adjusted my grip so my index finger was over the top of the blade. Chef's grip. I'd been holding it wrong, well, not wrong, but imprecisely, the way you do after decades of muscle memory calcifying into habit. She didn't apologize before she did it. I liked that immediately. Afterwards, when the class was finishing and people were photographing their finished dishes for reasons I find mysterious, she asked me where in Ireland I was from and said she'd heard Irish English was very difficult. I said it wasn't difficult, it was just correct. She looked at me for a moment like she was filing this away as data, and then she smiled, not a social smile, more like she'd decided something. We went for coffee after. A place around the corner. Que fait soi quo. We talked about food for an hour. She had strong opinions about cilantro. She used the American word cilantro, which I've always found irritating, but I let it go. And about the way Western chefs think pho is simpler than it is because the bowl looks simple. Told her about the Strand, about the ferry, about the way Irish hotel food in the 90s was an exercise in systematic disappointment. She listened in the way that suggested she was genuinely interested rather than politely waiting for me to stop. I booked the next class before I went home. The cooking, I told myself. It was about the cooking. I think even then, walking back along the Han River in the early evening, with the lights coming on across the water and the motorbikes everywhere, and someone somewhere playing something through a small speaker, I knew that wasn't entirely true. I just wasn't ready to say so yet. And honestly, what would I have said? 53 years old, divorced, living over a chipper, or I had been, and for the second time in a month, I felt curious about what was going to happen next. Seemed like enough. Seemed like more than enough, actually. I'm aware of how this looks. I want to say that up front, before you make the face I know you're making. 53-year-old Western man, 29-year-old Vietnamese woman. I know the arithmetic. I knew it then. Gary and the Tuesday morning lot certainly knew it. I could see it in the way the conversation adjusted when I mentioned her name the second time. That careful neutrality that English people do when they formed an opinion. They're too polite to say out loud. I'm aware of what it looked like. To say out loud, I'm aware of what it looked like. I was aware of it then. But awareness and wisdom aren't the same thing, are they? Here's what I can tell you about those first 2 months, and I'll try to be precise about it because I think the precision matters. She wasn't performing. That's the only word I can find for what she wasn't doing. The thing I'd seen other women do in the expat bars along my quay. That particular attention that sits slightly too close to your face, that laughs a half second after the joke rather than during it. Lynn was just present. She contradicted me about food constantly and without any apparent concern for my feelings on the matter. She thought the way Irish kitchens use butter was excessive to the point of medical negligence. She said my pronunciation of Vietnamese words sounded like a man falling down stairs. And she asked me questions, real ones, not script questions, about what a hotel kitchen in Limerick actually operated like, what the food cost pressures were, whether Irish people genuinely ate the things they claimed to eat. She grew up in a village in Quang Nam province, about 40 kilometers from Da Nang. Her father had died when she was 12, motorbike accident on the highway south of Tam Kha. Her mother raised her and her younger brother Min alone, which is a different kind of alone in rural Vietnam than it is in Limerick. There was family around, cousins and aunts. But the financial weight fell on the mother, and eventually on Lin as the eldest. She put herself through catering college in Da Nang by cleaning offices 3 nights a week. 5 years of that. Started at the cooking school as an assistant instructor 2 years before I arrived. I found this admirable. That's important to say. I didn't find this admirable. That's important to say. I didn't find it alarming. I found it admirable in the specific way that a working-class man from Limerick who started washing pots at 19 finds another person who worked their way up from nothing admirable, with recognition, with the feeling of meeting someone who speaks your first language. I think about that now. The recognition. How it smoothed over things that, in a different frame of mind, I might have thought about more carefully. The shift from coffees to dinners happened around week 4. No conversation about it. No conversation about it. No declaration. Just a gradual domestic gravity. She started texting me on Zalo, which is what everyone uses here, not WhatsApp, to suggest places. A bon bois spot near the Sijuwu Room bridge that she said was run by a woman whose family had been making the same recipe for 3 generations. A night market in Suahua, where a man grilled whole fish over coconut husks. I went because the food was genuinely worth going for, and I told myself that was the reason, and it was about 60% true. Then she came to my apartment, and we cooked together. It was a Saturday afternoon. She arrived with a bag from the wet market, lemongrass, galangal, kaffir lime leaves, a whole snapper so fresh it was still doing something with its gills. I had the hob and the knives, and the sort of professional's instinct that tells you what someone's going to do before they do it. We cooked a canchua, a southern sour soup, and we disagreed about the tamarind quantity, and she was right, and I told her so, which she noted with that particular satisfaction, just filed it the way she filed everything. We ate at the kitchen table, just filed it the way she filed everything. I watched her eat the second one and felt, I don't know. It's hard to put into words without it sounding like more than it was, but it was the first time in 18 months I'd cooked for someone and actually watched them eat it, and that meant something to me that I hadn't quite known it would. I wasn't exactly a catch, let's be honest about that too. 53. Divorced. A bad back and opinions about stock that people generally find excessive. Not much Vietnamese, but she seemed, and I am trying to be accurate here, not sentimental, genuinely at ease with me, not performing ease. Actually at ease. Around month 3 I learned about her mother's eyes. She mentioned it once, at the end of an evening, in the way she delivered most personal information. As a fact, not a bid. Her mother had cataracts in both eyes. The public hospital in Tam Kai had a waiting list of 8 months or more. There was a private clinic in Da Nang that could do both eyes in 2 weeks, same surgery, properly certified ophthalmologist, but it would cost 87 million dong. That's roughly 3,200 euro. She wasn't asking. I want to be clear about that. She mentioned it the way you mention something that is a problem and is going to remain a problem, and you have made your peace with that. She changed the subject. I didn't let her change the subject. I've thought about this moment a lot since. Whether she knew what she was doing, whether the not asking was itself a kind of asking, a more sophisticated mechanism than a direct request, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that my thought process was about 30 seconds long. She's not asking. Her mother can't see properly. I have 88,000 euros sitting in a savings account in Bank of Ireland, earning 1.2%, and the private clinic can fix it in a fortnight. It was not a difficult decision. I've spent more than 3,200 on worse things. At least this one gave someone back their sight. We went to the clinic together, the 3 of us, the day of the second procedure. Her mother, a small, careful woman with the posture of someone who has spent decades carrying things, came out of the recovery room, and Lynn said something to her in Vietnamese that I didn't catch. And her mother looked around the room like she was doing an inventory of everything she could see. And then she took my hand in both of hers and held it for a long time without saying anything. She was looking at my face with a kind of attention that was, I don't know. It just was what it was. I still think that moment was real. I'd still think that moment was real. I'd stake something on it. But here's what I also think, sitting here now with the benefit of everything that came after. That was the day the pattern was established. Not by her necessarily. By me. I'd shown what I was willing to do without being asked, which is a different thing entirely from a direct request, because it doesn't feel like giving. It feels like deciding. And deciding felt like being in control. I was the head chef. Everything in its place. Everything in its place. Everything in its place. Every station covered. And I did it to myself, with my eyes completely open, at a clinic in Da Nang on a Tuesday afternoon, watching an old woman count the things she could see. About 2 weeks after the surgery, Min came to Da Nang to thank me in person. He was 24, maybe 25, with Lin's same quality of direct attention and about 3 times the energy. He brought a box of Ban Xiu Zan from a shop in Tom Kai, mung bean cakes, wrapped individually in paper, and he shook my hand with both hands, the way Vietnamese men do when they mean it, and he sat at my kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about his motorbike repair business, his plans, a delivery company contract he was trying to land, the equipment he needed. I liked him. I want to be honest about that. I didn't like him because he was useful to me. I liked him because he reminded me of a certain kind of young man I recognized, not unlike myself at 24, if I'm being fair, full of plans and slightly reckless, and not quite aware yet of how many things can go wrong between ambition and outcome. I thought of him, already, as something like a nephew. I should have thought more carefully about what that meant. I was going to do next. Mean's business case arrived about 6 weeks after that first visit, typed out on his phone, and sent through Zalo with a long string of photographs attached. The workshop, the current equipment, the delivery company's contract offer, the specific machines required, he'd done his research. A commercial air compressor and a second hydraulic lift, both from a supplier in Da Nang, the total came to 230 million dong. That's roughly 8,500 euro. I read through it at the kitchen table with a K-Fee Swa, first Swa, going warm beside me and my chef's brain running the numbers the way it always has. The way I used to do with supplier quotes and menu costs. The business logic was sound enough. A delivery company contract is steady work. The equipment had a clear purpose. The repayment structure Min proposed, 8 million dong a month, about 300 euro, would recover the loan in just under 3 years, which is a reasonable term for a capital investment of that size. I've signed worse contracts in Irish hotel kitchens. At least this one had witnesses. I lent him the money. I want to be precise about that word, because I was precise about that word, because I was precise about it at the time. A loan. Documented. Min came to Da Nang for the bank transfer, and we sat in the apartment and wrote out the terms by hand in a mixture of English and Vietnamese that Lin translated, and Min signed it with the seriousness of a man who understood what he was committing to. I kept a copy. I still have it somewhere. It's not worth anything, but I still have it. The first repayment arrived on the 15th of the following month, 300 euro, transferred via the Vietnamese bank app, with a brief message from Min that said simply, "Thank you, brother." I read that and felt something I can only describe as structural, like a beam had been fitted that made the whole thing sound. This wasn't charity. I wasn't being taken advantage of. I was being paid back, reliably, by a young man who called me brother and meant it. He paid for 4 months. Then he stopped. Lynn explained it on a Wednesday evening, briefly, while she was washing vegetables at the kitchen sink with her back to me. She often delivered difficult things to the sink rather than to my face, which I'd noticed and chosen to interpret as shyness rather than strategy. There had been a problem with the delivery contract, a client dispute, a delayed payment from the company that was supposed to be the anchor of the whole arrangement. Min was sorting it. It would resume shortly. I asked for more detail. The detail was vague. I pushed a little. The vagueness held. And then she turned around and looked at me with an expression that I, and this is the honest version, simply could not read. Not guilty, not defensive, not asking me to accept it, just still. Like she was waiting for me to decide what to do with the information. I accepted it. I told myself, business problems are real. Cash flow problems are real. One bad client payment can unravel a small operation in about a fortnight. I know this. I've watched it happen to suppliers I'd worked with for years. A business problem is not a character problem. I chose the generous interpretation, and I chose it consciously, and I'd probably choose it again, which is the part that's hard to explain to people. The money never resumed. Min never resumed. Min never directly addressed it again. It became, quietly and without any formal conversation, a gift rather than a loan. I have thought about whether I should have pursued it. The honest answer is that I didn't want to, because pursuing it would have meant naming what it was, and naming it would have changed what I thought I had. By this point, Lynn had moved in. Month 5. It happened without particular ceremony. She had a bag at my place most nights anyway, and the apartment was comfortable and central. And one evening she arrived with rather more than a bag, and that was that. I'd moved to a bigger place by then. A proper 2-bedroom on a street behind Mackay. 11 million dong a month. About €400. Still reasonable, with a kitchen that was actually worth cooking in. She brought a small altar for the bedroom corner, the kind most Vietnamese families have, with a photograph and a stick of incense and a small glass of water that she changed every morning. I left it entirely to her. It felt like the right thing to do. And also, I'll admit, like I was being included in something I didn't entirely understand, but wanted to be part of. Her phone was always face down on the table. I noticed this within the first week of living together. She never left it face up. I told myself it was habit, or preference, or simply a cultural thing I wasn't familiar with. In my experience, Vietnamese people treat their phones with a different degree of privacy than Irish people do. And I'd learned by this point that not everything I didn't recognize was a warning sign. I chose not to mention it. I think about that choice now more than I think about any of the financial decisions. In September, she took me to Quang Nam for the first time. We drove down on a Saturday morning on the back of a Honda Wave she borrowed from a cousin, 2 hours south on the highway, then off onto roads that narrowed gradually into roads that were really just tracks with ambition. Until we arrived at a cluster of houses at the edge of a rice field that smelled of wood smoke and river water, and something green I couldn't name. The house was 2 rooms. That's not an understatement. 2 rooms. A sleeping room, and a room that served as kitchen and living space together, with a separate lean-to at the back for washing. The roof was corrugated plastic and rusted iron in roughly equal proportion. The wiring ran along the outside of the walls in a way that suggested it had been added as an afterthought in several different decades, by several different people with several different theories about electrical safety. I walked around it the way I'd walk around a failing kitchen, cataloging, mentally, what would need to happen to make it functional. New roof. Full rewire. Foundation work on the east wall where the ground had shifted, new cooking facilities. It was not a complicated assessment. The building was structurally tired and needed attention. It wasn't going to get without money. Lynn's mother came out to the courtyard when she heard us arrive. She was moving more carefully than she had at the clinic. The country roads are uneven and her knees were troubling her, but she was seeing everything clearly, and she made tea on a small gas burner with the efficiency of a woman who has performed this action 10,000 times. She served it in small cups without handles, and she sat across from me and looked at me with that same careful attention she'd shown at the clinic. And the courtyard smelled of jasmine from somewhere, and the sound of chickens came from behind the house, and 50 years of Catholic upbringing doesn't unlearn itself. That's the truth of it. 50 years of mass and family obligation and the deep cultural instruction that if you are able to help and you choose not to, that choice says something about who you are that you will have to live with. I sat there in that courtyard and felt the full weight of that instruction, and I was not asked a single thing. I offered on the drive back to Da Nang. Lynn didn't respond immediately. She looked out at the rice fields going past and was quiet for what felt like a full minute, and then she said, "It would be a lot." I said I knew. She said, "You don't have to." I said, "I know I don't." The decision had been made somewhere in the courtyard, honestly. The drive back was just the administration of it. And there was something in that. The feeling of having decided something solid, something that would exist in the physical world after I was gone. A house that would stand because of a choice I'd made. I understand now that I was building something. I was building the feeling of permanence in a life that had been stripped of it. The house was secondary. I didn't understand that then. The renovation cost 514 million dong, transferred in 3 tranches over 4 months. That's €19,000, give or take. I want to be clear about the numbers, because I think it's important that you understand. This wasn't reckless in the way people assume when they hear the story. Provincial construction in Vietnam is cheap by any Western measure. A qualified builder in Limerick would have charged 3 times that for the roof alone. The work was real, the materials were real, and I had a contact number for the contractor and photographs sent to my phone at every stage. I was not, I told myself, a man throwing money into a hole. I was a man commissioning a building project with documented progress. That's a different thing. I said this to myself quite often between October and February. The first visit was in November, about 6 weeks in. Lynn and I drove down on a Saturday morning with Banny Me from a stall near the CCN market, pâté and chili, ate them in the car like teenagers, and arrived to find 4 men repacking the foundations on the east wall I'd identified. The ground around them turned over and raw. I walked the site with the contractor, a quiet man named Hung, who communicated mostly in nods and pointed at things with a folded piece of paper. And I understood about 40% of what was being said, and didn't let on that it was that much. But I could read the work itself. The foundations were being done properly. The wiring was stripped and gone. The roof timbers were sound, where they'd been left, and replaced where they hadn't. It was a competent job. I felt, standing in that courtyard with the smell of wet concrete and turned earth, the specific pleasure of watching something broken become functional again. I know what that feeling is now. I was feeding it. The second visit was in January, a month before the work finished. The roof was on, properly on, zinc sheet with decent fixings, pitched correctly to manage the rain, and the interior walls were plastered and painted a pale yellow that Lynn's mother had apparently chosen herself. There were new ceramic floor tiles. The kitchen had a proper gas connection and a stainless worktop that the contractor had, for some reason I never established, installed at exactly the right height for a professional cook. Lynn's mother cooked lunch for the work crew that day. She made a big pot of canh quai mai, purple yam soup with pork, on the new stove, and there were about 14 people in the courtyard at various points during the meal, sitting on plastic stools borrowed from somewhere, and I counted the faces and recognized maybe 4 of them. Extended family, neighbors, people connected to the contractor. It didn't matter. I sat in the corner with a bowl of soup and a can of Bia Saigon that someone had pressed into my hand, and I felt, I know how this sounds, like I was part of something. Like the courtyard had a claim on me and I had a claim on it. I know what I was buying. I just didn't want to call it that yet. Right. The money. Let me walk you through it properly, because this is the part that matters, and I want to be precise about it. By month 8, my pension arrived on the 1st of the month. €1,100, directly into my Irish account, then transferred to Vietnam, and here's where every euro went. Rent on the apartment in Da Nang, €400, which I was covering entirely by that point, because Lynn's income from the cooking school was modest and variable. Her mother's medications, blood pressure tablets, and something for the arthritis that had got worse since the surgery, which the doctor said was unrelated but felt connected in my mind, came to about €60 a month sent down to Quang Nam. Min's shortfall, which had stopped being called a loan repayment and started being called assistance without either of us formally noting the transition, was averaging €150 monthly. A niece, Lynn's sister's daughter, 8 years old, school in Tom Kai, had fees of about €40 a term, which is nothing, but it was there. Food, utilities, transport, the occasional beer with Gary on a Tuesday, and Ty was coming. So that's your mise en place. That's what was going on of every month. 1,100 in, roughly 1,400 out. €300 drawn from savings every 30 days. Not catastrophic in isolation. Over time, a different story. I tried to talk to Lynn about it twice. Both times I was careful, not accusatory, not suspicious, just practical in the way that 30 years of kitchen budgeting makes you practical. I sat at the table and laid it out, the way I'd lay out a menu that wasn't working. The numbers don't balance. We need to talk about the numbers. Doppy team. The numbers don't balance. Both times she went very still. Not upset, not defensive. Still. The kind of stillness that in a Limerick kitchen means someone is 3 seconds from an explosion. But it never exploded. She just became very quiet and very present, and looked at a point slightly past my face and said very little. And I could not tell whether this was shame, or something she was managing, or something else entirely that I simply didn't have the cultural vocabulary to read. I backed down both times. I told myself it was cultural sensitivity. It may also have been cowardice. Gary's nod was in December. Tuesday morning coffee. Bayaj Kumching, the usual table. He asked how things were going, and I said fine, which was the accurate answer and also the incomplete one. And he nodded in the way that Gary nods when he has something to say and has decided this is not yet the moment to say it. Careful, deliberate, the nod of a man filing a thought rather than releasing it. I noticed it and said nothing, and walked home along the river thinking about it for about 20 minutes and then set it aside. I should have asked. I should have asked. I didn't ask. The small inconsistencies had been there for a while. Lin went home to Qingnam every second weekend, always alone, or with a cousin I'd met once, and I was welcome to visit briefly, but never to stay, and I'd noticed, without examining it, that her accounts of these weekends occasionally contained details that didn't quite match. A person who appeared in one story and wasn't in the next. A place she mentioned staying that was different from what she'd said before. She was not a careless liar, if that's what she was. The inconsistencies were small, but I'm a chef. I notice when the prep list doesn't match what comes out of the kitchen. I'd been noticing. I'd been choosing not to send it back. Tav arrived in late January. I want to tell you about this properly because I don't want you thinking it was purely transactional, what those few days felt like. It wasn't. Vietnamese New Year is, look, I grew up Catholic in Limerick. I know what it feels like when a tradition is genuinely ancient and genuinely held, when the ritual means something beyond its surface. Tafers at UT is that, multiplied. The whole city changed. Red and gold everywhere, kumquat trees on every balcony, the specific smell of incense from every house altar mixing with the smell of bonch chung, those sticky rice parcels wrapped in banana leaf, being cooked in pots that had been going since the night before. It was beautiful. It was genuinely beautiful, and I was included in it. And that meant something. We went to Quang Nam for 3 days. The house was finished by then and full of family. I didn't have names for, coming and going, bringing food, sitting in the courtyard that I had paid to rebuild, talking in a language I couldn't follow. Lynn's mother had put a photograph of her late husband on the altar with incense and fruit, the way you do, the way that connects the present family to the people who are gone, and there was something in watching that I recognized even without the language. On the first evening of tea, I gave red envelopes, Li XD, to 14 people. Children, mostly, which is traditional, but also a few adults. I was introduced to and immediately lost track of. Relatives. Neighbors. The contractor's wife, possibly. The amounts were small, 200,000 dong each, about 7 or 8 euro, which is normal. But across 14 envelopes it was still €100, and that €100 felt like the most natural thing I'd done in months. I was part of a family. I was contributing to a family. I was, briefly, a man with people to give things to. I was €34,000 in by then, and I genuinely did not want to count. So I didn't count. I sat in a courtyard I had rebuilt, in a village I couldn't have found on a map 18 months earlier, eating food that a woman I cared for had cooked in a kitchen that existed because of me, and I felt something I can only call, and I know how this sounds, belonging. Real belonging. Whether it was earned or bought, whether the two things are even different, I couldn't have told you then, and I can't fully tell you now. The new year began. We came back to Da Nang. The city went quiet for a few days, the way it does after tea, the motorbikes less frantic, the markets half open. Everyone sleeping off 3 days of family and food. Life resumed its shape. And then Gary sent me a WhatsApp message asking if I fancied a barbecue at a mate's place the following weekend. The wording was casual. The punctuation was careful. I knew, from the phrasing, that this was not a social invitation. Gary doesn't do casual carefully. When Gary is casual, he means it. When Gary is careful, he means something else entirely. I said yes. I'd been half expecting something. I just didn't know yet what shape it would take. The barbecue was at a place in Suan Tra, an Australian fella's house with a terrace that looked out over the peninsula. 8 or 9 people, the usual mix, a couple of the Tuesday morning group, some faces I didn't know well, someone's girlfriend. There were cold cans of Tiger and a bucket of ice, and someone had done ribs on a proper charcoal grill, and it smelled good. And I remember thinking that under different circumstances this would have been a pleasant afternoon. I knew Gary had something to say. I'd known since the WhatsApp. He was careful with me in the first hour, more careful than he usually is, which is already fairly careful, and he waited until most people had gravitated to the other end of the terrace before he came and stood beside me at the railing. Not confrontationally, side by side, both of us looking out at the South China Sea going silver in the afternoon light. The kind of positioning that older men use when they have something difficult to deliver. He said he wasn't sure if he should say anything at all. He said he could be wrong. Then he told me that he'd seen Lin twice, in December and again in January, at a cafe near Ruijing University, a place on Ngaimbrin Lin. He was specific about it, which told me he'd thought carefully about how to tell me. She'd been with a Vietnamese man, young, well-dressed, the way young professional Vietnamese men dress when they want to look like they have prospects. On both occasions, Gary had been across the street, far enough that she wouldn't have noticed him. On both occasions, the body language had not looked like colleagues. He said this last thing quietly, without editorializing, and then he stopped and looked at his can and waited. I thanked him. I meant it. I could see what it had cost him to say it. Gary is not a man who inserts himself into things, and inserting himself into this had required a decision I imagine he'd revised several times before landing on the barbecue as the least terrible context. I thanked him, and we stood there for another minute or two looking at the water. And then I went and got another beer and talked to someone about something I cannot now recall, and an hour later, I grabbed a bike home. Lynn was in the apartment when I arrived. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, grading something. She did occasional assessment work for the cooking school, correcting students' practical logs. She looked up when I came in. I said the barbecue was good. I made dinner. We ate. I didn't say anything. That was a Saturday. I said nothing. Sunday. I said nothing Monday. In a kitchen, if something's wrong with a dish, you don't send it out until you know exactly what's wrong with it. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I opened my mouth, because once I opened my mouth, there was no closing it again. So I went through it. All of it. 12 months of accumulated detail, held up to a different light. The phone, face down, always. The weekends in Guangnam. I was never fully part of, always a day visitor rather than someone who stayed. The inconsistency about where she'd slept on a particular weekend in November, which I'd noted and filed and not returned to. The way the money had moved from the beginning, each time without direct request, always received without discussion. The mechanics of it so smooth, I'd mistaken the smoothness for honesty. I thought about the man Gary had described. Well-dressed, her age, from her province possibly, given where she went every second weekend. And I thought about the space. There had always been a space in her life that I couldn't quite locate. A room I knew existed but had never been shown. I had interpreted this as privacy, as cultural difference, as the ordinary territory of a person who doesn't give everything at once, and maybe it was those things. But it was also, I understood by the third day, something else. By Monday evening, I knew what I was going to ask her. I sat down at the kitchen table after dinner. She was washing up. I asked her to come and sit down. She dried her hands and sat down across from me and looked at me with that still, unreadable expression. And I asked her, as plainly as I could. She didn't immediately confirm it either. She went still in a different way than she usually went. Still, not managed, not controlled, actually still, like the question had stopped something in her. And then she told me, not a secret boyfriend. She was careful about that word. A situation. A man from her province, from a village near hers whose family and hers had known each other for a long time. There was an understanding between the families, nothing formal, nothing written, nothing ever directly discussed between the two of them, but an understanding of the kind that exists in rural Vietnamese communities, where families make plans across generations and nobody explicitly states what they're planning. She'd come to Da Nang to work and build her career in her own life, and she had met me, and the situation had not ended, and she had not ended it, and she had not found a way to say any of this. The conversation lasted 4 hours. It never became a shouting match, which surprised me at the time and doesn't now. There was nothing to shout about. What she was describing wasn't betrayal in the way a thriller describes betrayal. It was more like two separate gravitational fields that she'd been trying to inhabit simultaneously without ever quite resolving which one she was going to commit to. I was the Western man with the money and the pension and, apparently, the willingness to fund a family's needs without requiring much in return. He was the man her family expected her to eventually be with. Both things had been real. Neither thing had been the whole picture, she cried. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. The crying was genuine. It wasn't a mechanism. It was the crying of a person who had been carrying something for a long time and was now putting it down, which is a different quality of grief than the performance of grief. I'd worked in professional kitchens long enough to know the difference between mise en place and theater. This wasn't theater. She apologized. She said it in a way that felt true and also insufficient in the way that real apologies often are, when the thing they're apologizing for can't be undone by the apology. And then she said, in English, that was more precise than she usually allowed herself when we discussed difficult things. I did not plan to love you. That part one did not plan. I believed her. I still believe her. And I want to say something about that, because people hearing the story will assume that believing her was naive, or that believing her was the last stage of being fooled. I don't think it was. I think she saw a lonely, decent man with money and a Western passport. And I think she made decisions that served her family and herself. And I think she also, genuinely, over time, developed real feeling for me that she was unable to cleanly separate from the practical circumstances that had brought us together. I think both things were true. I think she is probably not someone who experiences what she did as having done something wrong. I find that I understand this. I find it harder to forgive than to understand, which is a different problem. I believed her, and I left anyway. I moved back to my original apartment, the small one near my Kia that I'd kept paying for, partly out of bureaucratic inertia, and partly out of something I didn't examine at the time, within the week. I had my bag packed in about 40 minutes. The Wusthof went in first. We had one more conversation, brief. She didn't ask me for anything. Not an explanation, not a reconsideration, not money. She asked nothing. I have thought about this more than about anything else in the whole 12 months, because in some way that I find difficult to articulate cleanly, the asking of nothing made it worse. If she'd asked for something, I could have named what it had always been. She asked for nothing, and I was left with a version of the story I can't fully close. I booked the Dublin flight 3 days later. I told nobody at the Tuesday morning group. I just stopped appearing on Tuesday mornings, and I imagine Gary understood why, and I was grateful that he didn't contact me, because I wouldn't have known what to say. I landed in Dublin on a gray afternoon in late March. My sister Orla picked me up from the airport. She asked how the trip was. I said long. I asked about her kids. I was, she would tell me later, very quiet on the drive to Ennis. I already knew I was not going back. Orla's spare room in Ennis had a single bed and a view of the back garden and a radiator that made a sound like a small animal at night. I slept well in it. That surprised me. I don't know what I'd expected. Worse. I slept well, and I ate whatever Orla put in front of me, and I watched a lot of Clare football on the television in the evenings, and I helped with the garden at weekends because Orla's husband was working away, and the hedge needed doing. And I didn't talk about Vietnam except when someone asked directly, and then I said it hadn't worked out and let the sentence end there. 6 weeks of that. I found it, in retrospect, the most useful thing I did. I didn't go on the expat forums and process my feelings in public. I didn't ring a solicitor in Da Nang. I looked into that briefly, about 10 days after getting home, just to understand the landscape. And the answer was what I'd already suspected. There was nothing actionable. There was no legal mechanism that would recover money I'd freely transferred to Vietnamese bank accounts for purposes I'd freely chosen. Suing a Vietnamese family in a Vietnamese court for a house I'd voluntarily renovated on their land, with a written record of nothing except my own receipts. There was no version of that conversation I wanted to have, and the outcome was predictable regardless. I let it go. I stopped. Stopping, I've come to think, was the most sensible decision I made in the whole 14 months, including the ones I made before I got on the plane. Right. The accounting. I want to be clear about this because I started this story by telling you I did my homework, and I think you deserve to see exactly how the homework held up. Starting balance, March, first year, €88,000, plus pension of $1,100 monthly. The surgery, $3,200. The loan to Min, $8,500. of which 1,200 came back in repayments, so a net loss of 7,300. The renovation, 19,000. Monthly overspend, the €300 per month I was drawing from savings during the last 4 months I was there, 1,200. Sundry, the bits that don't fit a category, the additional time costs, small transfers, amounts too small to itemize but present. Call it another 1,500. Total, approximately €34,000. I have roughly 54,000 remaining. The bedsit on O'Connell Street is still mine, technically. I've been paying the rent remotely, which tells you something about the state of my planning, but it also means I have somewhere to go when I'm ready to face Limerick again. The pension comes in. The knives are still good. You've lost your larder, but you've still got your knives. That's the assessment, not ruin. Significant damage, the kind that closes certain doors and requires you to revise certain doors and requires you to revise certain plans, and means the retirement you imagined is no longer the retirement you're going to have. But not ruin. I went back to work in May. 3 days a week at a hotel kitchen in Ennis, one of those business hotel restaurants. The kind that serves a perfectly competent dinner to people who are thinking about something else. Not what I'd spent 30 years building toward, but a kitchen is a kitchen. It requires you. It tells you where to be and what to do, and at the end of service it's clean, or it isn't. And if it is, you did your job. I needed that. Less about the money than about having somewhere that required me to show up and be competent. I still understand that feeling better than most others. My daughters. Aoi Fei sent me a message in May when she heard I was back. Not a warm message. She's 20 now, and she has her mother's precision and her own reasons, but a message. I replied, "We haven't spoken. I think we might. Eventually." I don't push. Of all the things that happened in the last 2 years, the distance from my daughters is the one I can't put a number on, and it predates Vietnam by a considerable margin, and I try to be honest with myself about that, rather than letting Vietnam carry weight it doesn't entirely deserve now. Here's what I actually want to say to you, because I'm aware this story will get filed under Warning, Vietnam, and I want to be precise about where the warning actually applies. Lynn wasn't a con artist. I want to be clear about this. Not to protect her reputation, but to protect the accuracy of the lesson. Because if you misidentify the problem, you'll protect yourself against the wrong thing. She was a 29-year-old woman from a poor provincial family who came to a city to build a better life and met a Western man with money and a pension and genuine feeling. She made decisions that served her family and herself. She also, over time, developed real feeling for me that she was never able to cleanly separate from the circumstances that had produced it. Both of those things were true at the same time. I think that's genuinely how she experienced it. I think she probably doesn't understand what she did as having done something wrong. I find that I understand this. Forgiving it is a separate, ongoing project, so the warning isn't about Vietnamese women. And it isn't about Vietnamese women. It's about the budget. Think about those videos. The Manchester fella. The €1,500 a month. He was sitting in a cafe, and he was eating good food. And he looked very comfortable, and he was right about all of it. The rent, the food costs, the transport, the number in the spreadsheet. He was right. But the spreadsheet assumed something. It assumed he was going to live the life he described in the video. The life where you're alone, eating simply, living quietly, needing nobody. The YouTube retirement budget works perfectly for that man. That man and his spreadsheet are in excellent shape. But that man doesn't actually exist. He's a projection. Nobody with a pulse and a functioning need for human connection moves to a warm, beautiful, cheap country full of people and lives that way for long. You build a life, you meet someone, you find yourself in a courtyard in Quang Nam, drinking tea served by an old woman with arthritic hands and 50 years of Catholic guilt activates, and you decide, freely, with full information, to help. And from that point forward, the budget is different. It's not the budget you built in the bedsit at midnight. It's the budget that a life costs. The obligations that come with those connections, they're real. They're not always manipulation. Sometimes they're genuine cultural expectation. Sometimes they're genuine love. Sometimes they're both at once. And the combination is harder to navigate than a simple scam because, at least a scam has a villain and a verdict. A life doesn't come with those things. So here is the question I would ask anyone watching this before they book the flight and build the spreadsheet. Build the budget by all means. The YouTube man is right about the numbers. But then ask yourself, does this budget include a life? Does it include the relationships that will make it worth staying? The obligations that come with those relationships? The possibility that you will meet someone, and that meeting someone will cost you something, and that you will pay it willingly because that's what meeting someone does to a person? Or did you build a budget around a fantasy of being alone that you were never actually going to choose? That's all I've got. That question is going to sit with some of you. I know it will, because it's the one that tends to outlast everything else in Declan's story. Not the 34,000 euro, not the house in Quing Nam that still stands in his name on no paper whatsoever. Not even Lynn's line delivered in better English than he'd known she had. It's that question. Because the honest answer, for most of us, is that we built the fantasy budget, the one that worked perfectly, right up until we become human again. Declan's story isn't a warning against Vietnam. Vietnam is genuinely what the YouTube men say it is. Warm, affordable, full of extraordinary food and people, and a pace of life that is genuinely kinder to a tired body and a tired mind than a February in Limerick. The appeal is real. The arithmetic is real. Those things aren't the problem. The problem is what happens when you arrive as a whole person rather than a number in a spreadsheet. The obligations that flow from genuine connection are real in Vietnam in ways that can take Western men completely by surprise. Not because Vietnamese people are predatory, but because the weight of family, of filial duty, of the eldest daughter's responsibility to a widowed mother in a province without resources, that weight is genuinely enormous and genuinely expected and genuinely not manipulation. Sometimes it's both things. Often it's all three. The cost of a life in Vietnam isn't the rent. It's the life. If you're planning to go, and maybe you should go with an honest budget. One that includes the person you'll probably become once you get there. One that has a line item for what connection costs, and a limit on that line, and the self-awareness to enforce it before the limit is reached rather than after. Declan would tell you to go. He told me as much. He'd just tell you to take a different kind of homework. If this story landed for you, share it with someone who needs it before they book the flight. Subscribe to Inside Vietnam for more stories like Declan's. We're here every week, telling them honestly, because the best protection is knowing what you're walking into. We'll see you next time.